This is part 7. There's only 2 more parts, I think, according to my calendar, of this series that I entitled Life Without God. This is part 7. We started a number of weeks ago. We've been making our way through different sections and verses of the biblical book of Ecclesiastes, which I hadn't read in a really long time. I preached through the book of Ecclesiastes back in maybe 2010, 2011, and went back and read through it again a few months ago and thought, I want to preach through this again. It's a rich, rich book. And this morning, I want to focus your attention on Ecclesiastes 9. I'm just going to read 2 verses, 11 and 12. I had a brother who lives in South Carolina come this week. In fact, he left early this morning, but he stayed with us. And last night, I was probably like 9 o'clock, and I'm finishing my prep. And my brother, who is the stand-up comic of our family, he's the brother right underneath me, so he's 48, I think. And he said, do you ever just like get up there and wing it? And I said, no, not on I said, I do wing it from time to time, but never on Sunday morning. I'm always like working hard to prep. He's like, well, that's good, because if you just stood up there and winged it, then the Lord might take away this cush job that you have where you only have to work 30 minutes a week. I was like, it's true. I have people ask me that all the time. They're like, you're a pastor, right? So what else? What do you do Monday through Saturday? I'm like, oh my gosh, you have no idea. Sunday's the easy part of my job. But anyway, it was funny. He had me laughing. Okay, Ecclesiastes 9, verse 11 and 12, 2 verses. The writer says this: I have observed something else under the sun. The fastest runner doesn't always win the race, and the strongest warrior doesn't always win the battle. The wise sometimes go hungry, and the skillful are not necessarily wealthy. And those who are educated don't always lead successful lives. It is all decided by chance, by being in the right place at the right time. People can never predict when hard things might come. Like fish in a net or birds in a trap, people are caught by sudden tragedy. So the early 20th century American novelist Thomas Wolfe, who, by the way, was born and is buried in Asheville, North Carolina, where my mom lives, said this about Ecclesiastes many, many years ago. Of all I have ever seen or learned, Ecclesiastes seems to me the noblest, the wisest, and the most powerful expression of man's life upon this earth. And also the highest flower of poetry, eloquence, and truth. I'm not given to dogmatic judgments in the matter of literary creation, but if I had to make one, I could say that Ecclesiastes is the greatest single piece of writing I have ever known, and the wisdom expressed in it the most lasting and the most profound. Now, as far as I know, Thomas Wolfe was not a person of faith, but he recognized the realism in Ecclesiastes and he resonated with it. I do too. It's unbridled, honest exploration of the various ways we try and find meaning and life on our own apart from God is dead accurate. Whoever wrote Ecclesiastes, some say King Solomon, but most people think that it was someone who was simply taking on a Solomonic persona. But whoever wrote it was bold. They were honest. This person looked under the surface of things, explored the way life feels on the ground, life under the sun. And it's dead accurate. His observations are dead accurate. It can be, as you know, if you've been with us for any number of weeks, it can be a depressing book, but it's meant to be, because life without God is ultimately depressing. It can be haunting and uncomfortable at times. There have been a couple of these sermons I've barely made it through because it's so haunting and uncomfortable. But it's meant to be, because life without God is haunting and uncomfortable. I mean, we experience moments of enjoyment, we experience moments of happiness, we experience moments of connection, we experience moments of fulfillment. But detached from God, these things never last. They're temporary. And yet, life without God has a certain ring of freedom to it. I mean, it sounds promising. It sounds like a life without restraints, a life without boundaries, a life where some God in the sky isn't telling me what I can and cannot do. It's a life where I get to be in charge. And being in charge seems liberating at first, just like it did to Adam and Eve, when the serpent said, "You can be like God." That's where it all started. But you soon realize that this makes life very heavy and hard, because the longer you live, the more of a burden being in charge becomes. You start feeling the weight of that stuff. Martin Luther, my historical hero, called this the life of an unhappy God. In other words, it's unhappy because now everything that matters to you is up to you. Everything. There's no one outside of you that you can depend on for the things you need most. It's up to you. I mean, like I said, it seems promising at first, this idea that maybe there is no God, or I can live my life without God, or I can be my own God. It sounds promising at first, but then when you start evaluating it and looking at it a little bit more deeply, you start realizing how heavy and harrowing it can be. I mean, when you feel disappointed with life, for instance, when you want to be loved but you're still single, when you hit midlife and realize that you aren't where you thought you'd be, when you feel rejected by someone whose acceptance you crave, when you're contemplating mess-ups that you can't change, when you're overthinking decisions, does being in charge bring you comfort? It doesn't. In those moments, we're always looking for an answer outside of ourselves. We're looking for help outside of ourselves. I mean, self-dependence is not freedom. It's slavery, and those of us who have tried the self-dependent route know that to be true. I mean, being in charge is not a life of rest. It's a life of exhaustion. Well, in these verses, the ones that I just read, verse 11 and 12 of chapter 9, the writer shows that life is unpredictable and often unfair. It feels random and unjust at times, and there's no way to ultimately control it. He says in verse 11, I've observed something else under the sun. The fastest runner doesn't always win the race. The strongest warrior doesn't always win the battle. The wise sometimes go hungry. The skillful are not necessarily wealthy. Those who are educated don't always lead successful lives. I mean, life is not always fair. It seems unjust. It's unpredictable. It feels random. I mean, we can make plans and decisions that we deem wise, responsible, and sensible, but we can't ultimately control outcomes. That's the point he's making. In fact, if you skip to chapter 10, verses 8 and 9, he talks about the ironies of life. And he says, when you dig a well, you might fall in. When you demolish an old wall, you could be bitten by a snake. When you work in a quarry, stones might fall and crush you. When you chop wood, there is danger with each stroke of your axe. In other words, life in this world is not a safe place, even if you make wise decisions all the time, which you don't, but even if you did. Life in this world is not a safe place. It's not a predictable place. It's not a place that you can control. In fact, in chapter 9, verse 1, he makes it clear that God himself is unpredictable and oftentimes seems unfair. Listen to what he says. Chapter 9, verse 1. This too I carefully explored. Even though the actions of godly and wise people are in God's hands, no one knows whether God will show them favor. I mean, we can't control God any more than we can control the outcomes in this world. And yet, none of this stops us from trying. I mean, we are natural-born control freaks. Natural born control freaks. Last week I talked about the fact that we are unavoidably competitive, and this week it's the fact that we are inescapably controlling. More controlling than we probably think we are. One of the things that I love about chapter 9, verse 1, where he mentions the unpredictability of God and how we can't control God. This was kind of a sidebar thought that I had yesterday when I was prepping, because for people of faith who think that if I do the right thing and I live the right way, God will bless me and life will feel good and work out the way I want it to, what he's saying is that's a delusion. That is a subtle attempt on our part to control how God does things in our lives. If I'm good, if I dot my I's, cross my T's, if I do the right thing, if I live wisely, if I live well, if I do all the right things, then God will be obligated to bless me, to give me the life that I long for, to give me a life that I love. But that too is a delusion. As I said, we can't control what God does any more than we can control the outcomes we crave. And yet, none of it stops us from trying. It's been said that the root of control is fear. And that makes sense to me. That lands with me. It resonates with me. I find that to be true in my own life, that whether I like to admit it or not, my fear of things not panning out the way I need them to or the way I think I need them to always triggers every attempt on my part to control people, to control situations, to control outcomes. I mean, I depend on my ability to control things to make me feel safe in this world, to make me feel secure. And I don't think I'm alone. I think we all do that to one degree or another. My dream is to one day have a family compound, okay? I've got 3 kids. I have 3 grandkids. And I have dreamt now for years of finding some place out in Jupiter Farms at some point, couple acres, where everybody could live, okay? Now, Stacy and I would have our own home, okay? But where everybody could live, where everybody could gather. And while that seems fun and admirable on the surface, the truth is that some of that desire is driven by fear. I want to be in control of the environments my kids and grandkids are in. I feel like I'd be less worried about them if they all lived close and I could control things more effectively. It's sort of like an inflated sense of responsibility driven in part by fear. Fear of how my kids will handle things, fear of how my grandkids will grow up. I mean, I think we do this more often than we realize. I think we all try to ensure that things go a certain way. We spin narratives, we keep secrets from certain people to try and control what they think of us. When I crashed and burned and very publicly bottomed out back in 2015, I was like my own worst PR person during that time. I was spinning the narrative and telling half-truths because I was trying to repair my image. I wanted my old life back. And in order to do that, I had to figure out a way to control the way people thought about me. And I had just crashed very publicly in a big way, and everybody knew some bad things about me. And so I had to repair that image. I had to figure out a way to repair that. And I spent that entire year, basically an entire year, spinning narratives, keeping secrets from certain people so I could control what they think about me, telling enough truth to make people think I was humble and sorry, but not telling the whole truth. I was PRing with the best of them. God, incidentally, shut that down after a year when other things came to light. A year after the big thing came to light. God has his ways of setting us free sometimes that feel very mean. I was, for whatever reason, reflecting on the story of Jonah yesterday. And if you're familiar with that story, God calls Jonah to go preach to Nineveh, this wicked, violent city. And Jonah hates the Ninevites. And so he gets on a boat and heads in the opposite direction. He's running from God. I'm not going to do that. And God comes after him in the form of a storm. And whatever happened over the next 3 days was, I'm sure, very memorable for Jonah. Okay, apparently he was thrown overboard and some big fish swallowed him, and he lived in the belly of a fish for 3 days, which I can't imagine what that would have been like. And then the fish vomited him up on the beach 3 days later after Jonah surrendered, blah, blah, blah. But I thought to myself, God spares no expense in coming after us when we are going the wrong direction. He just does. And sometimes it comes in the form of something like a fish, living in a fish in Jonah's case. Something crazy, something seemingly mean. But we wear masks. And we're professional mask wearers. We hide our ugly parts. We lie to ourselves and we lie about ourselves, all because we're terrified that if people really knew the truth about us, they wouldn't love us. They wouldn't respect us. They would leave us. They would bail. We try to control the way our kids turn out. We try to control the way our spouse responds to us in a particular situation. We try to ensure that an experience or a relationship or a certain amount of money will deliver the security and the fulfillment that our hearts crave. I mean, we work overtime to control things whether we realize it or not. We work to make those things happen, but all too often we don't understand what's really going on under the surface. We're not as self-reflective and self-aware as we might think we are. What's really going on under the surface? Oftentimes we evaluate things on the surface. We think about the way we respond to things, and we try to modify that behavior if our responses are destructive, but we never get under the surface and go, why? Why is that so triggering to me? Why? Why do I respond in this way? Why do I react in that way? And so when it comes to our control freakishness, we oftentimes we don't look under the surface long enough to go, why? What's really going on? Why do I tend to be so controlling in this situation or with this person? Well, what's really going on is that we're trying to calm our fears by controlling things. And that's a game we can't win. No matter how hard we try, we can't win that game. Because the things that matter most to us, we can't control. We've never been able to control. I mean, you may get a promotion by working hard, but you can't control whether your coworkers respect you. You can't control what they say about you. You can work hard to look good and be really sweet, but you can't control whether he or she falls in love with you. You can't control that. You can apologize for the hurt you've caused your kids or your wife or your husband or your friends or your parents, but you can't control whether or not they forgive you. You can't control that stuff. The deepest longings of the human soul, things like love and forgiveness and security and meaning and stuff like that, those things transcend the resources you have in yourself, outside of your control. So if being in control of things is your chosen way to feel calm and safe and secure in this chaotic world, you will be, as the writer to Ecclesiastes says, chasing after the wind. Chasing after a calmness that you will never catch. A sense of security and safety that you will never catch. And that's what the writer is getting at in the verses that I read, verse 11 and 12. He's essentially saying, listen, I've watched how this world works and I can't figure it out. No matter how much I plan, how hard I work, or how wisely I live, nothing is predictable. No outcome is certain. None. Life in this world is chaotic. It's unpredictable. You can make, as I said before, you can make wise plans. You can make wise decisions. You can choose to live in a wise way, a healthy way. But you can't control the chaos in this world. Walker Percy, who was another Southern American novelist, once asked, "Why does man feel so sad in the 20th century?" He wrote this a long time ago. Why does man feel so sad in the 20th century? Why does man feel so bad in the very age when he has succeeded in satisfying his needs and making the world over for his own use? I mean, in reality, we have more control over things now than we ever have before in history. But even those things, what Percy's getting at is that even those things we are able to control haven't calmed our fears. I read an article yesterday on what to do about controlling behavior, control freakishness, okay? And it was interesting. It's very perceptive. After identifying that fear and anxiety are the underlying causes of controlling behavior, the article gave a long list of things we can do to get our need to control under control, okay? It was very ironic. It wasn't until I got to the end of the article I was like, this is inescapable. I mean, even an article on how to manage controlling behavior is an attempt to get some measure of control. I mean, it's inescapable, okay? Ever since the Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve decided that they wanted to be God for themselves, and we inherited that crap, ever since then, we have been control freaks in ways that we may be aware of, and in ways that we're probably not aware of. I mean, now, the point, okay, is not that all forms of control are bad. Obviously, I mean, according to God, self-control is a good thing. Okay, we can avoid a lot of disaster in our lives and in this world if we can exercise some self-control in areas where we tend to be destructive. Okay, that's not what he's getting at here. But if we're honest, we have to admit that our controlling tendencies are more often than not controlling us. They're not primarily driven by this virtuous desire to exercise self-control, even though that's good. But even our desire to exercise self-control is not a pure, sinless desire. That too is corrupt in some way, whether we can detect it or not. So what do we do? Okay, we're screwed. I mean, we're control freaks. There's, that's just sort of our lot in life. I mean, what do we do about this? I mean, what's the solution to this problem of crippling fear that prompts us toward controlling behavior in the smallest, most subtle of ways? I'm not talking about the big stuff that's obvious to all of us. I'm talking about the little stuff that you can detect in a short conversation with your spouse, or a sort of a way that you feel inside, even for a moment when your child doesn't respond the way you want them to. Okay, all of those are indicators of our control freakishness. So what do we do about it? Taking a page out of recovery circles, the first thing to do is admit it. Okay, admit it. Own it. Accept the fact that you're more fearful than you think you are, and that fear is the underlying trigger point for any and all of your controlling tendencies. Just own that. Okay? Know that about yourself. Accept that. Because fear is never, ever weakened by denying its existence or pretending that you're not as fearful as you are. And ironically, the reason it's such a tough and humbling admission is because we're afraid to admit it. I mean, reluctance to admit our pervasive fear is another evidence of our pervasive fear. So just own it. Accept that truth about yourself. Accept the truth that you are way more fearful than you may have ever thought. And that fear is so much of the driving force behind your addiction to control, my addiction to control. That's the first thing, okay? Just admit it, own it. Recognize that this is not a problem that you're going to be able to solve by yourself, okay? It's just a part of who you are. It's a part of who I am. We are broken people living in a broken world with other broken people, and fear is just a part of our system. It's a part of our internal system. It's a part of our external system. The way so many things are run in this world are driven by fear. The way we decide things in our own lives is driven by fear. The thoughts that we think and the things that we feel oftentimes are driven by fear. I mean, there is a sort of a bedrock of fear underneath almost everything we are and everything we do. So just admit it. That's the first thing. Just acknowledge it. It can be a pride-swallowing admission. But there's a lot of freedom that accompanies admission to weakness, like afraidness or fear. The second thing, okay, that's the first thing. The second thing, and the writer to Ecclesiastes gets at this at the end in chapter 12, but the second thing is to fear God. Okay, now that is a phrase that's always been confusing to me. Okay, it's in the Bible all over the place. There's a lot of that phrase in Proverbs, the book right before Ecclesiastes. But I mean, this idea of fearing God, that never made sense to me. I heard about it a lot growing up as a kid, and I kind of knew it was an important thing, that God valued that sort of thing. But, you know, in my mind, fear always meant afraidness. I'm scared. And so it didn't make sense because God was supposed to be a friend, a comforter, a forgiver, a lover of sinful souls. So to think of God as someone I'm supposed to be scared of or afraid of didn't jive with me. I think that phrase is massively misunderstood because when we think of fear, we think of the kind of terror that makes you run away from something. That heart-pounding terror that paralyzes you. But that's not at all what the fear of God is. To fear God is to be in awe of his grace, in awe of it, blown away by his grace. It's a reverential wonder at his power to fulfill his promises to you. It's a breathtaking amazement at the strength and the certainty of his mercy and his forgiveness. To fear God means that we trust him. We trust him to do what's right. We trust him to do what's good. We trust him to protect us. We trust him to be there for us. We bank everything on him. We put all of our eggs in his basket. That's what it means. To lean into him, to trust him. And because of that, the fear of God makes you run toward him, not away from him. As I said in my prayer earlier, I mean, he is the one dependable feature of our lives, reliable, dependable, someone that we can trust or entrust everything to, not only our lives, but the lives of those that we love. The fear of God makes you run to him, not away from him. It is the deepest of all comforts. And it's the reliever of our deepest dreads. It is our refuge. It is our strength. It is our ever-present relief from the need to quiet our fears by being in control. That's the driving force behind our need to be in control. Is just maybe if I can get control of this situation, if I can get control of this person, or if I can get control of my life, then my fears will be quieted. But that never works. It's the fear of God, our refuge, our strength, our ever-present relief, that's where we get the sort of the fear-quieting peace that we long for. Remember, and I've said this before, real freedom involves two confessions, two simple, basic confessions. They're simply these: I can't and God can. That's it. That's where real freedom is found. Freedom in the midst of fears, freedom from our fears. When we trust that I can't do it, but God can, that changes everything. I mean, it changes everything. It will change every relationship you have. It will change the way you feel about every relationship you have. Because now you don't have to work so hard to fix this person or change this person, because fixing them or changing them helps you feel more safe, helps you feel more secure. It's our job to love people. It's God's job to change people. Full stop. That's it. That makes life a hell of a lot lighter to be able to admit that, to say, I can't. Now, that's a tough admission, okay? That's not an easy confession. I can't. We're told wherever we look that we can do anything if we just put our minds to it, if we work hard. Every time I watch an awards show, the Grammys, the Oscars, or, whatever, to see who wins what. And the speeches are just so ridiculously annoying, okay? Not only does everybody get up and have to give their political opinion about how to change the world, okay? But they always try to inspire people by saying, I'm proof that if you just put your mind to it, you can accomplish anything. If you work hard, you can accomplish anything. I'm like, dude, I put my mind when I was 10 years old to being the quarterback for the Dallas Cowboys. I worked toward it. I'm a preacher, okay? It didn't pan out for me. So, there's a lot of things, if we're honest, that just doesn't even ring true. It sounds inspiring for a moment, until we bump up against the walls of our own weaknesses, our own inabilities, and those sorts of things. So it's a difficult admission to say, I can't. I'm powerless in this regard. But it's so freeing. And when you can admit, following that admission, that God can, and that God promised that He would. He didn't promise every outcome we desire. Okay, I've shared this with my kids before, but if God gave me everything I'd ever prayed for, I'd be dead. I would be. I'd be dead. Dead or in prison, or, in a lot of trouble somewhere. So God doesn't always, when I say that God can and promises to meet our needs and be there for us, I'm not saying He promises to deliver all of the outcomes that we crave. God knows better than we do what we need, what's best. He knows. He knows us better than we know ourselves. And there's real freedom in that. Real freedom in finally being able to admit, I can't do this, but God can. And while we will never be fear-free in this life, ever, we can be assured that even if our deepest fears come true, we'll be okay. We'll be okay in the end. So this is what God is saying to you and to me this morning. He's saying, let me take that burden from you. Cast all of your fears on me. I'm big enough. I'm wide enough. I am the friend who will never leave you. I am the light behind the darkness. I am the shining your fears cannot extinguish. I am the door where you thought there was only a wall. I am what comes after deserving. I am gift without cost. I am. He is strong enough. He is loving enough. And He gives and gives comfort to people who are afraid, because people who are afraid are all that there are. So come to me, he says, all you who are weary and burdened and scared, and I will give you rest. Let's pray together. God, thank you that your grace is sufficient and that your mercies are new every morning. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.